Hello, this is Derek Taylor from Early Modern Europe, History of Early Modern Europe. This is our lecture on absolutism, the age of absolutism, absolute monarchy and modern government from about 1648, about 1750-ish. We're not big on dates in these lectures, as you notice. So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about what absolute monarchy was, why it arose, and its place in this era immediately after the end of the century, after the 30 Years' War, which brings to an end the wars of religion and effectively ends the Reformation period, basically. And so just first part of the lecture is going to talk about, in general, what happens politically speaking in Europe after the Treaty of Westphalia is signed in 1648. And we'll show you a map here to begin. Again, at the end of the war, for the most part, nobody really won the 30 Years' War. If anybody did, it was probably France, because France has its borders enlarged slightly at the end of that war. If anybody can be said to have won it, but this is effectively the makeup of these territories. And what's going to happen in the post 68 and 48 period is you're going to have, and I should mention one of the things that happens in this is you have the independence being granted to Portugal. They had been sort of made into one country with Spain in the 1580, and you have a few other territories changing hands here. But for the most part, you want to take a look at this for a second. Just notice how, in this map, how scattered a lot of territories are. Look at Spain and its dominions over in Naples. It controls Sardinia and southern Italy. Look at Austria with its dominions over here. It's got sort of scattered territory. Look especially at, because it'll be very important at the end of this blue territory here. This is Prussia, Brandenburg, Prussia. It's the same entity. Look at how scattered it is. Little bits and pieces over here, in there, right here near Pomerania, and of course, eastern part of Prussia is in what was then Poland, Lithuania. It's the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Notice how broken up these things are. Notice, by the way, in 1648, that Sweden has territory on the continent. Sweden's a power. That'll change, as you'll see by the end of this. But this stuff is going to change. But you have all these broken up territories and states. This is one of the things that you're going to see in the period after Westphalia. Is you're going to have states try to consolidate themselves internally and try to acquire territory externally to make themselves more defensible. And the big thing, of course, after 1648 is what we call absolute monarchy becomes the dominant political form pretty much all across Western Europe and parts of Central and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe as well. France, Spain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Portugal. I should have put Sweden in there as an absolute monarchy for a long time. There are other absolute monarchies I can mention here. It's by far, it becomes the dominant form of political life throughout Western Europe for reasons that I'll compare in a moment. There are other political formations that survive this sort of onslaught of absolute monarchy, one of which I'll talk about next time in the next lecture, which is England/the United Kingdom, Britain for short. In 1660, after the civil wars had come to an end and Oliver Cromwell dies, you eventually have the monarchy restored in 1660. For the better part of the next 30 years, there's going to be a real struggle between Parliament and the King. And what's going to happen is, this is going to, I'll get to this next time, it's going to end with a revolution in 1688. And then in 1707, England unifies, signs an act of union with Scotland, and becomes the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And we'll get to this next time. It makes England into a very different sort of polity, and it makes effectively Parliament supreme in that country rather than the king. Very different, as we'll see. We'll get to what that means next time. There are a few other types of polities left. There are a couple of elective monarchies, essentially, and neither one of them is very powerful or influential, politically speaking, by the time you get to the late 17th century. One's the papacy. The College of Cardinals elects popes to this day still. Back then, of course, they still had territory in the center of Italy, the Papal States, an elective monarchy. And the Holy Roman Empire still persists in this time period. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Still persists in this time period as an institution. It's still there. It's become an adjunct of the Austrian lands. The Austrian Habsburgs have most of their territory in Austria now, so it becomes the base of their power. But they still hold, it's still an elected monarchy, and they still mostly becomes tied to them, with a couple of exceptions in the 18th century. Eventually, it's tended to see as a declining institution by the time we get to the 18th century, but it's still there, it's still important to them. Marks them out as very different. One of the reasons, as you'll see, Austria almost doesn't really merit the title of an absolute monarchy for a lot of reasons. Older types of monarchy that are going out of fashion. And then finally, there are a few republics left in the 17th, early 18th centuries. Most famously, the Dutch, the United Provinces, you know about them, broke away from Spain. Merchant Republic, Calvinists, relatively tolerant of religious diversity in the Netherlands. The Republic of Venice, up until the 17th century, had been a fairly important maritime power. It begins to decline in the latter half of the 17th century. It's essentially an oligarchy of rich merchants, aristocrats in Venice. By the 18th century, it's already a tourist destination. It's already gone the way of the dodo. City-states like that are already passé. And then finally, the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania. I know it sounds confusing to call it a republic, but it effectively is. It has an elected monarchy, but power is held by the nobility in Poland-Lithuania, and they think of themselves as being a commonwealth or a republic. And in particular, I won't go into too much detail. It's a very big territory, but it also has, it goes, I'll say, decline. It will become less and less powerful as the 18th century progresses. But those are the only other types of polities, major polities, left in Europe after 1648. A few notes on what dominates political life and diplomatic life after Westphalia. It'll become to be dominated by state interest, by perceptions of state interest. In economic terms, by the way, this means something like mercantilism. I'm not going to go through it here. Your textbook will mention that. Mercantile policies are meant to strengthen your own state, kind of at the expense of others, to build up bullion, gold, wealth, and build up trade, a balance of trade that favors you over other nations. These types of things will occupy state builders and ministers and things like this throughout the period, rather than religious policy. Although it's still important, as we're going to see, very important actually, just not the, again, we already did this towards the religion, and you haven't really separated religion from public life, so it's still there. But in terms of policies, they're mostly focused, or at least primarily, in the first instance, focused on state interests. Politics is still dominated by monarchs and dynastic issues all the way to the period. That's a continuity that does not change in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. One thing that will change is that Spain is no longer the dominant power on the continent, and France will come into its own. And the international balance of power will be increasingly to check French ambitions by the early 18th century. So these are all the changes here. And finally, again, I mentioned some of this already, rises and falls. You're going to have the continuation of Austrian and French rivalry. That'll go on throughout most of the first part of the 18th century. Another major change will be the rise of Russia and its entrance into great power politics in Western Europe. This is a major shift. The Duchy of Muscovy had not been a major player, to say the least, in Western affairs. Only starts calling themselves czars in the 17th century, and beginning to want to have a place among the great powers of Europe, starting with Peter the Great. We'll get to him in a moment. Another major rise is Britain becoming a great power. They will, after 1688, become a great power for the first time, and especially as you get to the middle of the 18th century, which will go to the time where they become the dominant power. They will replace, in some ways, France in the 18th century. They'll become their great rivals. Have not been for many centuries, really, the English. Then it becomes the British, so it's a different deal, but they'll become a power by the early 18th century. And this is sort of balanced with the decline of Spain and the Netherlands. I mentioned the Netherlands already. The Netherlands, after the 18th century, never play a major role ever again, really, in European affairs. Sorry. And the Spanish are on the decline. They're still important because of their empire. In fact, they'll be something of a, we'll say a renaissance, but they'll have some influence in the 18th centuries, but clearly in decline by the middle of the 17th century. The 30 Years' War, these things drain the Spanish government. They'll make reforms, as we'll see, in the 18th century to strengthen their empire and their government, but no longer a dominant force, even though they're one of the powers of Europe still. And then finally, probably the most shocking thing that happens in this period is the rise of Prussia. And I showed you there because they had this tiny state broken up by great distances, but they'll become a major power by the end of this period. So major changes in the offing in the century after Westphalia. So that brings us to absolutism. What is absolutism? We'll talk about this as a theory, because there's a theory, there's definitely a theory of absolute, well, we'll get into this in a second, but the nomenclature is important, absolute monarchy and practice of it, which are kind of different. You may have gotten some of this, I don't know, in high school, but it's probably different than what you have in your imaginations, as I imagine. The first thing to note about this, when we say absolutism, I need to make this distinction. For the most part, contemporaries did not use that term, absolutism. It's a term we use in the modern era to describe theories about monarchy, but not only monarchy. That's the thing I'll go about here. But basically, absolute monarchy, as we define it, means there is no authority above the king on earth, save God alone. This means the king cannot be legally judged in any way or held accountable by any other authority, assembly, parliaments, other nobility, aristocrats, courts, etc., etc. That he has no authority. He is responsible to God alone. And in principle, he can, in theory, involve himself in any aspect of the state that he wishes, in theory. In practice, he is restrained. He is restrained by traditions of government, local government, as we'll see, very restrained, by traditions of government, traditions of traditional rights granted to people in the past by monarchs. But also, of course, he has to respect things like religious, divine, law, church. He can't go doing weird things with the church, or natural law. So in practice, these absolute monarchs have a lot of restraints. As you're going to see in a moment, this theory is meant to justify attempts to overcome a lot of these restraints, which are not all that effective. But that in practice, there are actually a lot of restraints on the king's authority in this period. The last thing to mention about this is that this is basically a post-Renaissance / post-Reformation theory. That is to say, in the Middle Ages, there were no absolute monarchs in this sense. And if you're wondering how this could be, well, two things. One, in the Middle Ages, we'll get to this in a moment, but this is basically a response to, revival of things like Roman law had been never gotten rid of, but ideals of absolute monarchy go back to the ancient Roman Empire to a certain degree, but even more in response to the chaos of the Reformation, as we'll see in a moment. We'll talk about the two of the major theorists for this. And the most important person in this regard is a man named Jean Bodin, who is a French jurist writing during the French Civil Wars in the 1570s, writes a book in 1576 called The Six Books of the Commonwealth. And during the 1560s and 70s, in response to all this stuff, you had a lot of French legal theorists talking about French law, because of course they're trying to figure out what to do with all this chaos, right? And there were some theorists, many of whom were Huguenots, French Protestants, who wanted to argue that traditional French law meant you could restrain the king. It meant you could oppose him legally and all these sorts of things. Remember, this is in the context of where you're having, Huguenot communities trying to defend themselves against violence and committing violence on their own terms, trying to, sometimes preemptively. And so you have this idea, and I'll come back to this. I'm going to give you a little lecture on social contract theory, so bound up with this dispute. And remember also the French Huguenots, remember their leadership was mostly aristocratic. And what happens is, what Baudin's mostly famous for is he introduces the notion of unitary sovereignty into political theory. Unitary sovereignty means basically there is ultimately only one authority in a state. And state is different than sovereignty. It's just confusing. Don't worry about it. There can only be one sovereign. You can't share sovereignty. And that one sovereign's will runs everywhere. It cannot be abrogated or restrained by other bodies, other institutions. Sovereignty is one. And this is the other trick about his theory, is that this doesn't just apply to kings. It applies to any, there's basically three forms of government in his mind, any form of legitimate form of government, which are monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy. The will of the sovereign is absolute, whether it's a person or a group of persons. And the reason why this has to be, of course, and this goes back to why this is a break with medieval tradition. In the Middle Ages, there was no unitary sovereignty, and kings could not claim to be judged by no one on earth. You know why? You guess? That's right. There were other bodies. Who would judge the king in the Middle Ages? Well, first of all, the church, which they made repeated claims. The papacy especially made claims to not only excommunicate, but to depose monarchs in the Middle Ages. This is partly aimed at that. Remember, in the French Civil Wars, you have the Catholic League, which is the extreme Catholics, who, if the king doesn't go their way, they're talking about assassinating him and stuff like this. They try to. Actually, they do actually in one instance of Henry III. And so that's one aim of this, is to put down any alternatives to authority. The other, by the way, in the Middle Ages, alternative to authority were, of course, aristocracy, the nobility, who had their own law courts, who had their own armies, who were the source, of course, of a lot of rebellions. And of course, they were the source of the leadership of a lot of the Huguenot communities in that time period. So it's a response to this chaos. And the idea is there has to be one absolute authority whose will is final, beyond which you cannot appeal. Otherwise, you'll have chaos. That's the basic idea of Baudin and a lot of the thinkers that follow him. And I'll get to some of this next time. So I'm going to talk about this in my little talk on social contract theory. Well, I guess of the 18th century as well. Other major thinker before the 17th century, before Hobbes and Locke in England, is actually James Stuart. And by James Stuart, I mean King James VI of Scotland, who becomes King James I of England. James Stuart is if you don't know, this is the king who authorizes the King James Bible, is a theologian. He's a very bright guy. King James is a very bright guy. He writes a couple of works, actually. The more famous one, I think, is The True Law of Free Monarchies in 1598, while he's still the King of Scotland. And it's the result of his experiences in post-Reformation Scotland. Remember, the Reformation came to Scotland through rebellion. And in fact, during his infancy, he was basically kidnapped several times, kept in sort of isolation. He had a real, his upbringing was kind of exciting, let's put it that way. And he came to be really suspicious of religious ideas that justified overthrowing monarchs. And he became one of the leading theorists of what's sometimes called divine right monarchy. That's the term they would use other than absolutism. Kings that rule by divine right are absolute. And that's what the true law of free monarchies means. That's what he means by absolute. You have to be freed from the interference of other bodies in order to bring order and stability to your society as a king. Why? Because you're ordained by God to do this. And James makes the whole point that you have to be free to do this, and you are accountable to God alone. He repeats what I've already mentioned, though, that you are not, does not mean you can do whatever you want. Again, James was a religious guy, by the way. He's also homosexual, almost certainly. So he's kind of a weird dude. But he definitely believes in an afterlife and hell. And so you seriously are going to be held accountable for your actions. And he says, well, if you're a bad king, well, it's wrong to do so. By the way, this is the other thing that comes as a corollary to this, that it's always wrong to oppose the state authority. It's a sin against God. And yet, if monarchs sin, they'll raise rebellion against them. And James goes through those. He's a very intelligent guy, James was. He gives a pretty good defense of what for us is an unthinkable, form of government. and criticizes those other forms of government that might, allow for this sort of thing. And he also rejects forms of ecclesiastical governance. What I mean by that is you have both Catholic and you have papal theories of, he gets into an argument with Robert Bellarmine, the Catholic prelate, friend of Galileo, about this in the early 17th century. And they have a back and forth on this because Bellarmine's a proponent of what's sometimes called indirect papal authority in civic affairs. That is to say, he sort of directs the people who direct the state to do what uphold the Catholic faith or whatever. And he's rejecting any interference from ecclesiastical authorities because, God alone has king alone has divine authority coming from God. But also more extreme sort of Calvinist theories where the church, the state is subordinate to the church. This becomes one of the main stays of absolute monarchy, even in places like France, where it's a Catholic country. There's a tradition of the French church, sometimes called Gallicanism, the Gallican church, being independent to a large degree from Roman interference. And so this idea that, again, a state is a sort of self-contained thing, which has beyond which there is no appeal, is one of the things that absolute monarchs are trying to establish in the 17th century, 16th and 17th centuries, coming out of the wars of religion and the other conflicts of the age. And so, these are some of the first attempts at centralized territorial states, anything like a modern sense. You have in the 17th, 18th century, the creation of, for the first time, what we think of as being formal administrative structures. Again, you have a few things in the Middle Ages, chancery, stuff like this. But literally the language of government as we understand it comes into being by the end, for example, of Louis XIV's reign in France. By the end of by the end of his reign, the early 18th century, the word administration, I guess in French, is being used to refer to royal government. In England, the term government takes on its modern meaning in the 18th century as being a sort of central, consolidated, unitary government. We'll see this happens next time in the Revolution of 1688. The term bureaucracy comes into parlance in the 18th century in France. So this is the creation of what we think of as any sort of, it wouldn't even look like government to us, what went on in Europe before late 17th century, really. The things that there's nothing the government can't stick its nose into today. There's almost nothing it does in the 17th and 18th centuries. And so for this reason, absolute monarchies were absolutism, but mostly monarchies. Absolute monarchies are seen as progressive. They're the cutting edge of government. In fact, they'll begin to pioneer as you get farther into the 18th century, scientific methods of government, using, getting the Enlightenment on this, but ideas of government that are using the latest ideas to govern their populations. This is where you get in the latter part of the 18th century, so-called enlightened absolutism. It is monarchies and absolute monarchies which are the source of most proposed reforms in this period leading up to when we get to the French Revolution, rather than any other body. Aristocrats don't want reform. Churches don't want reform. It's the monarchies who want this for reasons, well, I'll get to this right now, actually. They want it for two reasons. One, warfare. They want their states to be more efficient so they can raise more money, so they can raise more troops, so they can consolidate their territories. It's one of the biggest drivers of all of this. The second thing, of course, is the need for internal unity in their states. We've already talked about the wars of religion. Even if that goes away, you still have all these, as we're going to see, again, I'll explain this in a moment. The state isn't a unitary thing for the most part, for reasons that become apparent. You have all these groups that have privileges and rights and customs that can't be abrogated. So one of the reasons absolute monarchy attempts to sort of overcome this so that you can have a unitary state in our terms, which they don't have. Then, of course, you have, again, I mentioned places like Prussia, Austria, Spain, where you have territories widely different from each other, speaking different languages, having different religions. You need unity. And so the authority of the monarchs are supposed to sort of provide this to a certain degree. So we come back to when we talk about the history of it, we're usually looking at France. And just to give you a brief overview of what happens, I stopped off last time in my narrative, and then to give you narratives in the textbook. After Henry IV, of course, ends the civil wars and issues the Edict of Nantes, granting toleration to Huguenots, French Protestants. He's not well liked. Protestants think he's a traitor. Catholics think he's a usurper. He suffers at least a dozen assassination attempts in his lifetime, and finally somebody succeeds. In 1610, a Catholic fanatic named Francois Riviac kills him. His son, Louis XIII, after a few years' regency, will become the monarch. And he does something in 1614, which is very important. He dissolves the Estates General and never calls it again. What is the Estates General? The Estates General is the medieval parliament, representative body for the whole country, basically, in the Middle Ages in France. And I should point out this when I say the Estates General, this is not like a modern, it's not like the House of Representatives or the modern parliament in the UK. You're not electing people for, constituents aren't electing people for representatives in these bodies. What the Estates General represent is not the nation, it represents the estates of society. Estates are like castes. And the three estates in medieval thinking, which last up until the revolution in France, are the nobility, the clergy, and then everybody else, the peasantry. And so you will have elections for the peasantry, but they're not supposed to represent territory or constituents. They're supposed to represent those orders. And of course, those medieval assemblies were called to do things like have taxation. Of course, they're run by nobility. Who do you think is most resistant to monarchs taking control and establishing absolute authority? That would be the nobility. So they get rid of them. And they start ruling the country through their own ministers. In particular, from 1624 onward, two cardinals, French cardinals, members of the Catholic Church, will dominate life for the next several decades in France. First, Cardinal Richelieu, the one who guides them into the 30 Years' War. And then later on, after he dies in 1642, Cardinal Mazarin, cardinal of Italian extraction, will rule after the death of Louis XIII, along with, I think it's Marie of Austria, but it's the Austrian regent for the infant Louis XIV, excuse me. He's born in 1643, and they rule in his name until 1661, when Louis takes power himself. And in fact, after the 30 Years' War, you begin to have agitation at a local level, and then finally at a wider level in France by these nobility who are resistant to these attempts to establish monarchical rule, absolute rule in that sense. And so there's a rebellion in the late 1640s, early 1650s against this, which actually discredits the nobility to a certain degree. It lowers their esteem in the eyes of the public, both educated and not educated. And the monarchy comes out of this even more, looking even better, right? It's this sort of source of stability. It'll put out all this trouble. So it's called the fronde. The fronde is a French word for a slingshot. The idea is you have these, childlike aristocrats causing this trouble or whatever. But anyway, long story short, the fronde ends with the authority of the monarchy strengthened. And so when he does come of age in 1661, Louis XIV, Sun King, the Roi Soleil, will become the model for an absolute monarch in the rest of Europe. We don't know if he ever actually used the phrase, l'état c'est moi. It doesn't really matter. It's a good indication of how he ran his government, because he really did run everything. That's the thing that makes him so interesting as a figure, Louis XIV, because he worked really hard. This is the thing we have to understand about absolute monarchs. They would spend, pretty much all day. Let me give you a description, by the way, of Louis XIV's daily life at Versailles. It's pretty. Just to see how this goes. He wakes up at 8:30, and basically he's dressed by his attendants while he has aristocrats in his room watching him. This seems strange to you? Well, it should seem strange, but basically you have, the most important members of the court there while he gets up in the morning. Maybe around 100 people. It's that many people. By 10 a.m., he goes into procession to the Hall of Mirrors in the king's in the Versailles, followed by his courtiers. At this point, the crowds all gather so they can see the king. Some may speak briefly to him, some of them have handwritten note. He sits down in his chair in the royal chapel. He has mass, which lasts for half an hour, and then goes back to his apartment. He holds council on Mondays every 2 weeks. On Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays, the state council or high council is held. Tuesdays and Saturdays, a financial council is held. There's a council of conscience on Fridays. That's religious affairs. The dispatch council, which deals with national affairs, meets once a month on Mondays when there's no state council meeting. And so he'd have 5 or 6 ministers working with him on projects. That's 11 p.m. At 1 p.m., he dines alone in his bedchamber, seated at a table, which was supposed to be taken in private, but he had to have it, admitting all the men of his court. Generally, those been present at his rising ceremony in the morning. 2 p.m., king gives orders and announces his plans. Had given his mornings in the morning. He goes on a walk, and if he goes hunting, maybe go hunting after 2 p.m., something like this. In Louis XIV, in the evening, 6 or 7, he would leave indoor entertainment, have indoor entertainment for the aristocracy that's gathered at Versailles. And while he would go off and sign letters, he might spend several hours signing letters. At 10 p.m., the crowd would hurry into the king's antechamber to attend dinner at the royal table. The king would sit down, members of the family. Once the meal was over, he'd go greet the ladies of the court, and then finally he would retire to his cabinet to converse with his family and close friends. And then at 11:30 p.m. at night, he would have his going to bed ceremony, where, again, the exact reverse. You have all these people come in and see him undress, get finished, and then he'd finally go to bed. He worked from sunup to sundown almost every day of his life. And in fact, most of the absolute monarchs, again, if you want to take control of the government like this, you had to do it yourself. So when he says l'état c'est moi, or he didn't say it or whatever, it's a good indication absolute monarchs had to work hard to govern their territories for reasons that will become apparent. And of course, I've already mentioned the Palace of Versailles in my lecture on the Baroque. It's the place, of course, where you bring all these aristocrats so you can display yourself before them and keep an eye on them. I should say, by the way, this is not just, we'll get this in a moment. It's meant to sort of, again, make the aristocracy invested in the monarchy, so they won't rebel against it, which it works. It is not, as you'll see, a total domination of them. It's also where, and this is something I can't stress enough, the court ceremonial of Louis XIV at Versailles was really, really, really burdensome. It required almost everything he did was prescribed by a certain sort of etiquette, and he was a real stickler for keeping it. And we know, by the way, the aristocrats didn't like it at all. It was exhausting. You had to wear all this finery. You had to do all these things. You had to do all this stuff. If you screwed up, you might upset the king, and you'd be in bad with the king, and that'd be terrible. Courts of these claustrophobic, at least in Versailles, this claustrophobic existence they have. It'll be, by the way, the actual court ceremonial will be relaxed under his successors, who weren't nearly as big a stickler for it. But it's sometimes referred to as part of the so-called civilizing process. This was an idea a scholar named Norbert Elias had back in the 20th century, that this was part of a process of civilizing, the nobility, teaching them not to argue about things like politics or religion, disciplining them, if you like, to live a certain way, to contain all the tensions that are present in the life of the court, which will eventually filter. And again, things like, ideas we have of civility, right? That's what he means by civilizing process. You don't talk about politics and religion in polite company. You don't do nasty things like pick your nose or fart in polite, that sort of thing. Disciplining the body and the mind. for this model of absolute control, right? All focus on the king. It's really intense. Part of this model, by the way, of absolute monarchy is bringing unity to a country is, of course, in religious terms. The Huguenots were broken militarily in the 1620s and 30s by the French kings, by Louis XIII and his generals. A couple of battles, La Rochelle in 1628 was a big one. Point is, they're no longer really a threat. But in 1685, Louis wants to make, again, he's trying to make his state more uniform. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, the Edict of Toleration, and expels the Huguenots, mostly from France. And they'll go to places like the Netherlands and England when they are welcomed. This is part of that drive for uniformity and absolute monarchy. And then finally, as we'll see, he fights a series of wars. And this is the last thing to mention about France as a model, but absolute monarchy as a model of government. It seeks gloire in French terms, glory for the French state. His aim was, I think get this right, Louis XIV, to make the king first in France and France first in Europe. And I mention this because, this sounds awful to us, conquest, stuff like this. It was popular. I can't stress that enough. Louis XIV was a popular figure among ordinary people. We know this during his reign. People like winners. You win wars, and he won a lot of them. Actually, he gets checkmated, as you'll see at the end of his life. But for the most part, it's a successful reign, militarily and politically speaking. People love a winner. They love success. And again, if you focus everything on the monarch, he's got to bring gloire to his people. That's part of the deal. That really is part of, even today, if you're a militarily incompetent government, you don't really have a lot of legitimacy. It's one of the first basic things about government, at least as it comes out of, this time period, actually. So absolute monarchy is, it is a popular form of government, strangely enough. And it has influence all over Western Europe. You're going to have people wanting to imitate the roi soleil. Even in England, which we'll see, they get away from this in the 1680s, 1690s. But briefly before that, Charles II, before his death, he dies in 1685, he dissolves his parliament in 1681 and never recalls it. His successor, James II, actually does call a parliament, but eventually they, for reasons we'll see, dissolves it as well, with no intention of recalling it. It could have easily, both of them, by the way, admired Louis a lot. It was actually they were related by marriage. Could have gone in that direction, seemed to want to go in that direction. Didn't, for reasons we'll get to next time. In Bourbon, Spain, as we'll see in a moment, a Bourbon relative of Louis gets on the throne of Europe, throne of Spain in the early 18th century. And during the course of the 18th century, they will actually import certain French administrative reforms into the Spanish monarchy and the Spanish Empire. Similar thing will happen in the kingdom of Piedmont, Savoy, which is a major kingdom in Italy, one of the bigger kingdoms. It'll also, with less exact copying and less absolute in that sense, will copy some of French administrative reforms in Italy. And then finally, Portugal, which again in the 1640s finally gets its independence from Spain, manages, because of wealth coming from its Brazilian territories in the 18th century, to stop calling its parliament as well. It rules an absolute monarchy through a large part of the 18th century. Again, in imitation of the Sun King and of France in general. It becomes a dominant cultural and political influence for a long time in Europe. However, as I mentioned before, it has this cultural influence. People want to imitate it. It doesn't necessarily have that much success, or I'll put this in the terms, it has limits. A lot of them, actually. I mentioned the intendants. I haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the things Louis XIV did was regularize and establish a system called intendants. They are salaried officials who go out in the countryside, in the provinces of France, and carry out the king's will Now, this is usually sometimes taken to be, wow, this is absolute monarchy, can go wherever it wants. In practice, they were fairly limited in what they could do. They could not, they basically went to the provinces to gather information. They had to have the king's sign off to do anything. And they were deeply resented by people in the localities, in the local, by local governing institutions that we'll see in a moment. There are a lot of, and in fact, never really overcome for a variety of reasons. The intendant system, by the way, one of the things they eventually were required to do was collect taxes. And the thing is, they were salaried and everything, and they couldn't buy and sell the offices. But when they went to collect taxes, it was essentially a system of tax farming. You were supposed to require a certain amount of, get a certain amount of tax from where you went. This kind of led to a lot of corruption, because when you tax farm, you can always sort of skim some off the top when you do this. One reason they were so resented. But in fact, they couldn't necessarily gather taxes for everywhere in the country. Why is that? I'll give you an example of this. If you recall, France at the end of the Middle Ages, as it comes into being, is a collection of different territories that have been gathered by the French monarchy through marriage mostly. And what that means is these places have all been independent kingdoms or dukedoms before being subsumed by the French crown. What that means is they have their own traditions and customs, laws, governing institutions. And what it means is the king's authority doesn't necessarily run through all of these places. In theory, it does. In practice, mostly it didn't. Mostly. For example, there was a tax that was hated because it was imposed in the later part of the Middle Ages by the French monarchy to gather, money for fighting wars, called the gabelle. It's a salt tax. In some places in France, by tradition, they might have been exempt from this. And that's the key thing here. It was almost some ways impossible to impose taxes on these various different places because they had different legal traditions and different governing systems. In particular, the types of institutions that tend to be most resistant to royal authority, and which could block it, by the way, were called parlements. Parlements are these sort of assemblies of nobility, lawyers in various provinces, the most powerful one being the Parlement of Paris, who the king actually had to have the sign off on these parliament, especially the Parlement of Paris, to make his royal edicts law. And they could, did on occasions, defy the king. And so in practice, his authority was actually limited by these things. And in fact, this is one of the things, these limitations are really entrenched. They won't really get wiped out until the French Revolution. It's one of the things revolutions basically, it's basically, honestly, it's one of the reasons that people make the revolution happen, but it is one of the things they're trying to get rid of, all these exemptions from the law of the nation, as they call it then. But royal law doesn't run everywhere, even though it's supposed to. And this finally brings us back to the aristocracy. The aristocracy, of course, again, it used to be thought among historians that, Louis XIV broke the aristocracy. He brought them all to Versailles, where they're basically, trapped there. And he raised up, servants, middle-class people, bourgeois, to be his ministers as a sort of counterweight. And this is the end of the aristocracy. We know that's not true anymore. The aristocracy was still very important for a lot of reasons. And he needed to get their investment in his government. He did, largely, partly because they did have power to scuttle his ideas, partly because, for example, in his army, that's where his officer corps came from. You weren't going to get middle-class merchants to run your armies for you. So the aristocracy is still a check, a powerful one, on the monarchy, especially in domestic affairs as you go into the 18th century. And as you're going to see, never really overcomes these obstacles. One of the reasons why the revolution will happen, actually, way up in the later on in the 18th century. So there are actually lots of limitations to absolute monarchy. And in fact, there are different, it's not the same everywhere. If you're I'm reducing this to, for the sake of time, there's another model of absolutism which emerges in, of all places, Sweden in the 1680s and 90s. Remember, Sweden is a power in the 17th century. They form more or less sort of empire on the Baltic in Northern Europe from the days of Gustavus Adolphus, the great king. And what happens is Charles XI, King Charles XI of Sweden in the 1680s and 90s, and they still have a parliament at this point. It's only in the 18th century, early 18th century, you're going to have absolute monarchy, and this is when you have absolute monarchy taking place there. He does something that's very, well, one thing is he streamlines the administration of Sweden, puts the finances in order, and does something, again, this won't happen in England really until the 19th century, draws up a government budget for the first time. This is how amateurish government was before the modern period, before the 19th century. Most importantly, however, he puts the Sweden under Charles XI puts the army on a sound footing by instituting an allotment system. And the allotment system was a system where they would take royal lands and grant specific farms for soldiers and officers, where they were so they could support their families. So they have enough money to support themselves during wartime. And so this reduced the expenditure on military concerns. And in his peacetime, these people lived as farmers. And I mention this because this is going to be copied throughout the other parts of, well, the other successful absolute monarchies. The first of which is Peter the Great in Russia. Peter the Great, of course, the first czar is his father Alexis in the early part of the 17th century. By the time they begin to dominate their neighbors in Eastern Europe, Peter goes to Western Europe, goes on a tour in the 1680s and 90s, wanting to bring back Western ideas. Western, there's a Westernization process of his elite. Again, he goes to France, goes to England. There's a story of him going to England and being sort of playing around, horsing around, I guess, with Sir Edmund Halley, the guy that discovers Halley's comet in the wheelbarrow. By the way, Peter the Great was 6'8". He was a giant of a man. Anyway, but one is he'll bring back Western ideas. What he mostly brings back are Western military tactics, which he'll use. And so there's a Westernization, which is kind of superficial to a certain degree, except in terms of administration and military preparedness. But one of the things he does, he copies that model, copies the conscript model, conscript soldiers within his own realm, and builds a powerful army that way, as well as, and this is something that'll be common to Russia and Prussia, is really bringing the nobility into the service of the state and making them, again, from feudal noblemen to officers of the crown. One of the things Peter the Great does. As will happen in Prussia. And Prussia has the biggest problem of any of these powers. It's tiny. Its population, even in the later part of the 18th century, is only like 6 million people. One of the things that makes France, by the way, France, so powerful is it's huge. It has like over 20 million people. It has, most of its territory has, good arable farmland. And so it can feed a growing population. It can, live off of its agricultural, prosperity. It's wealthy because of that. Russia doesn't have that. So what they're going to do in the 18th century, they're actually going to introduce several reforms. They'll create, probably more than any other nation, a bureaucracy centered on the monarchy. We get to Frederick II, Frederick the Great. But even before then, his father, his Frederick I and Frederick Wilhelm I, his predecessors, building up a state in which the Junkers, which are the nobility in Prussia, become sort of service nobility, as they call it. They become officers of the state. And you have, conscript armies, which again trains people for war. And this will be how they become this great military power. It shocks everyone in the 18th century, but Prussia's a military state in many ways. Even though its court will become a center for culture later on, it's also absolutist in this regard. And then finally, Austria, which again, you almost might not even call it an absolute monarchy just because it's kind of antiquated. You remember, the Austrians, of course, have this thing where the Austrian ruler is also the Holy Roman Emperor, so it has that burden. What happens, as you're going to see, is they also reconquer Hungary. So you have this dual system where you have this place that already, before the Ottomans conquered it in the 16th century, its own traditions, its own customs, its own monarchy being absorbed. So it's definitely a composite state, as you'll see from the map I already showed you. Austria's territories are spread out. It doesn't really make a lot of serious centralizing reforms until the end of the period we're talking about here, for reasons that become apparent. The one way in which it might be called an absolutist monarchy is it does try to establish confessional conformity in its lands. It basically tries to expel, and does sort of successfully expel, Protestants from its land. It can't do this, by the way, in Hungary. There's still a Calvinist minority there among the nobility, which, by the way, consists to this day. You don't know who Viktor Orban is, the current president of the state of Hungary. It's sort of become a bête noire of liberal internationalist types at this point. He's a Calvinist, even though Hungary, not a very religious country, but still majority Catholic in terms of their baptisms and everything. Austrians do manage to do this. However, they're never able to really reform our Austrian emperors, the church, in ways that, say, for example, the Council of Trent envisioned. Why? Opposition from the nobility. Would have cost them money. One of the problems that happened earlier in the century in Austria is that, like in Protestant lands, a lot of church land was secularized. It was seized. And to provide, because one of the things they wanted to do was provide in these places, okay, you've either made people conform and become Catholic or gotten rid of them. So you have people who are recent converts. They want to install better pastors, better do all that stuff. Well, that costs money, because you need to provide livings for these parish priests, and for upkeep, and for particularly making them educated. A lot of these converts wouldn't be, one of the advantages the Protestant churches had is they were only churches of the devout. They weren't big churches of an entire state or a big international polity. The bigger your organization, the more you always have people who are not really on board with your mission. But if you're a small church like the Huguenots in France or other places like that, you're just the elect. You're just the devout. And so that was one of the criticisms that, Protestants had of Catholic. How these people who don't believe, who are obviously going into mass and stuff like this. And so the idea in Austria was, and the Austrian emperors or Austrian monarchs tried to pass legislation doing this. They couldn't really override the opposition nobility, so nothing really happened all that much. So even there, it has limitations, even though more or less, de facto, they're basically there's confessional uniformity. It's not as effective as you would think in many regards. And finally, just to bring this to a close, we'll talk about war diplomacy, because this is largely, besides the internal factors, which I think you've kind of gotten the message here. They want internal peace, unity, and all that stuff. They want, success in warfare and diplomacy. And this drives a lot of the creation of this. And of course, one of the bigger drivers of this is the 14th. He fights several wars. I think these are the major ones. There might be more that I've forgotten. He fights a war of devolution with the Spanish, brief conflict in which they basically takes a couple of cities from the Spanish Netherlands in 1667, 1668. But his major conflict, his biggest success, is the Franco-Dutch War from 1672 to 1679. The Dutch had been joined again with the Spanish, I guess, in the earlier conflicts, and he wanted to punish the Dutch, so he crosses into the Netherlands. And this is where he has his greatest success. He takes several cities from the Spanish Netherlands. The Dutch, by the way, in order to prevent their country from being overrun, which they would have happened, they actually, if you don't know the Dutch, the Netherlands, it's called the Low Countries because they're below sea level. They have dikes to keep the water out. Well, they destroyed the dikes and flooded their territory, so the French couldn't cross. It's the only reason they weren't taken over. And eventually this arouses a coalition against him. He actually initially has, for example, the English are on board with this. His cousin Charles signs a secret treaty. The English hate the French. But eventually his allies sort of begin to abandon him. But he eventually does sign a treaty, the Treaty of Nijmegen in 1678. The conflict comes to an end a year later, which grants him some of the territories that he's been, successfully taken. So it's a win for him. Not so much the 9 Years' War, which breaks out in 1688, partly because, and this is, we'll get into the revolution of 1688 in the next lecture, we'll call against him a bigger coalition this time, because you're going to have well, first of all, Dutch, who are now their stadtholder, Wilhelm of Orange. This is the Dutch government's kind of hard to explain. It's a republic. They have, the provinces have their own assembly. There's also a royal house of Orange, and there's a hereditary stadtholder, they call it, who's kind of their executive, who more or less by the end of the 17th century has become dominant. And Wilhelm is the stadtholder of the Netherlands. Long story short, he goes and invades Britain and makes himself king of England. And the reason for that is so he can use their power to oppose Louis XIV, which they do more or less successfully. It comes to a stalemate in 1697, the so-called 9 Years' War. The most important of these conflicts is the last one Louis fights. In 1701, the last Habsburg king of Spain dies without an heir. And so, wanting to have his kingdom, his empire, if he can, kept intact, he leaves it in his will to one of the sons of Louis XIV. And the powers of Europe don't want this. They really badly don't want this. They do not want Louis XIV adding to his dominions Spain and its empire. So they form a coalition, and they fight a very long extractive war called the War of Spanish Succession, which, as I've mentioned before, I think in one of my lectures, this has theaters of conflict in North America. But what happens basically is he tries to invade Louis XIV, some of his enemies' territories. What this calls forth, however, is a coalition of the Kingdom of Piedmont, Savoy, and a great general, Eugene of Savoy, who manages to push them back and go back into France, and so they defeat them there in the Netherlands and other places. And it calls forth the first great English general in centuries, a man named, ready for it, John Churchill, who won a series of stunning battles, places like Ramillies and Oudenarde and other things. And I can't remember the name of the battle, it's not the big one, but his battles are the first ones that stopped the French advance and then begin to push them back. And if you're wondering, by the way, his wife Sarah was a courtier at court. That name, John Churchill, that's right, that's the ancestor of Winston Churchill. for his great victories in Europe during the War of Spanish Succession, he'll be named the Duke of Marlborough by Queen Anne, and Winston Churchill is descended from that line. So yeah, the first great general. However, France is so stable, their army is so well supplied, they try to invade the coalition. France doesn't really work. So in other words, they managed to check his expansionist ambitions, but in the end, they can't keep him from putting a Bourbon on the throne of Spain. But with the caveat that Louis can never inherit the empire, and the Austrian Habsburgs have to be, and so it has to be separate, basically. Spain and France are separate entities for that reason. And so, despite some people say, well, his ambitions were checked, they were to a certain degree. But for the most part, Louis XIV expanded his territory, made his kingdom the greatest in Europe, and got one of his sons on another throne of Europe. I'd say that's a win by the end of this period. Just give you an idea where things stand. At the end, at the Peace of Utrecht, as it is called in 1714, does it have the major? I don't know, it has the major battles here, but does not. Anyway, but you can see where territory is at the end of this. You have Austria, which comes out good in this. They inherit some of the Spanish Bourbon territories. They have to give up their territories, Naples and Sardinia. That'll eventually go to Savoy eventually. There's Savoy out there in northern Italy. You see where Spain, of course, France is there. You see, you will see where some of the main fighting was in these places during the wars itself. You also see claims, of course, English claims, French claims in North America. This is part of this as well. So it's an imperial conflict as well as anything else. Also notice, by the way, you have a couple of territories, Minorca and Gibraltar. These will be important for Britain in the 18th century because it's kind of a maritime power. So you have these two bases, which are very important for naval supremacy later on. So you have this change. You will also see Yeah, and so you'll have this change of territory, which again stymies France to a certain degree, but it's still the major power in Europe at the end of this. Again, it's one of the reasons why Louis is so popular. But even beyond Western Europe itself, you have wars being fought throughout this period. First of all, on the seas between the English and the Dutch, the two Protestant powers. Why are they fighting? Trade, dominance of trade. I mentioned this earlier that Oliver Cromwell fought a successful war in the 1650s, takes the city of Dunkirk from the Dutch, from the Spanish, I guess. Great moral victory. The Dutch smashed them in the 1660s and the 1670s, and the wars are unpopular because the English people side with the Protestant Dutch. So those are the conflicts beyond the boundaries of Western Europe. They also have a series of wars in Eastern Europe. Most especially the wars fought by Austria against the Ottomans. They fought an unsuccessful campaign in the 1660s against them, but important ones from 1683 to 1699. And that's important because in 1683, the Ottomans were already on the decline by the late 17th century, made one last attempt to take Vienna. And Vienna, this will be a huge turning point. There's a sort of coalition army put together. The Pope, sends troops, Austrian monarchy, as well as the King of Poland-Lithuania, John Sobieski. They are sent to raise the siege of Vienna in 1683. This, by the way, is where we get coffee from. Coffee gets in from the Turkish camp into, or not Turkish coffee. I guess it's one of the things that comes there. There's already coffee in the period there, but it's Turkish in its origins. But this is where you get. This is where you get the croissant from, the crescent, at least so-called, that come in from the Ottoman camp. But the Ottomans are defeated and turned back. And this is hugely significant because they will never again make an advance into Europe. Nobody was there at the time. But over the next 16 years, the Austrians will fight another series of wars where they will reconquer Hungary from the Ottomans. They will take back all the lands that were conquered in the 16th century by the Ottomans. And this is a revolution for a lot of reasons. One, all of a sudden, over the next 50 to 60, 75 years, Vienna had been a small border town right on the border of Ottoman territory. Very, it's kind of like, in no man's land. Now with Hungary being the border territory with the Ottomans, Vienna will become the great, cultural center. The 18th century, you probably know it as, if you know it at all, the city of Mozart and Haydn and all that other stuff, because it's freed from that threat. The second major thing that happens in 1699, at the end of the war, is that they sign a treaty with the Ottomans, the Treaty of Karlowitz. And this is hugely significant. Why? Because this is the first time the Ottomans have ever signed a peace treaty with a Western power. They never signed any treaties before. They just ordered them to surrender certain things, and they did, because they'd always won. And so for the first time, their power has been checked. And even from 1683, after the siege of Vienna has been lifted, you begin to have, actually gets into a popular song, it'll become a commonplace of 18th and 19th century Europe. You'll have the idea that, Ottomans have been a threat before, and a problem, because they're, on the doorstep of Europe. They'll become a problem going forward because they're now the quote unquote sick men of Europe, because they become an easy prey for these other powers, at least a target for them, because they're on decline. Even then, they fight several more wars. They fight another war in 1716, 1718, which completes basically the conquest of territory from the Ottomans. They fight another one in the 1730s, which they lose, actually, along with the Russians, but doesn't change the general direction of things. And then finally, lastly, in the early 1700s, 18th century, there'll be the Great Northern War, where between Sweden and Russia. There's actually one of their powers involved, in particular. The Prussians get at the end of this, but not in a big way. And the Polish who lose out on this. But in the Great Northern War, this is when Peter the Great, after suffering some initial defeats, revamps his army along Western lines and defeats the Swedish, takes their territory. This is when he builds his city on the Baltic, St. Petersburg. This is the end of Sweden as a great power. Their Baltic territories are taken, most of them, and Russia becomes a great power at the end of this period. It's what makes Russia into a serious a serious player in this. Just a couple of pictures here again, the clash of absolute monarchies. Peter the Great, reigning from 1672 to 1725. And then Charles the 12th of Sweden, reigning from 1682 to 1718. You can kind of see again, very Western. Again, this is a Russian here. He's supposed to be, all Slavic and everything, up in the guise of an absolute monarch with his, again, with his martial armor, right? Absolute monarchs are supposed to be great military victors. Same thing here. Swedish king has military uniform on, so that's how they see themselves in many respects. And then finally, we come to the last great conflict here at the end of this, and this is the War of Austrian Succession. And again, this will be, I mentioned this before, how Prussia becomes a great power. This is going to be fought mostly between Prussia and its allies and Austria, and we'll get to this in a moment. It's going to be fought over this territory here. Remember how we showed in the beginning, again, how scattered Prussia is. Prussia doesn't have a lot of territory, doesn't have a lot of resources. They're going to take this territory of Silesia from Austria, and we'll show you why in a moment here. Now, this happens in the 1730s. What happens is that Charles VI was the last, was the Habsburg king in the early 1700s, 1720s, but all of his sons died. He's left with a female heir, Maria Theresa, who will actually take the throne as Empress, Maria Theresa. And so what he does is he leaves all his territory to her, and he gets all of his nobility, and he gets several of his neighbors to sign what's called the Pragmatic Sanction. It's get them a guarantee that after he dies, they will not invade her territory. So he dies in 1739. Prussia invades the territory and takes Silesia. And this is the doing of the greatest general of the age, Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great. And he becomes the marvel of the age. People wonder at this because Prussia doesn't have resources. They don't have a population. And yet he turns Prussia into this military power because of the reforms, because of his form of government. It'll become another model, the last great model of absolutism because of this. And he retains it. Again, this is the reason why absolute monarchy is popular. You win, takes the territory. Nevertheless, Austria survives. He tries to conquer Austria, doesn't work. In fact, it will spur Austria to reform its government, particularly its army, but even its central government. It'll begin to become, and especially after Maria Theresa dies, she's very traditional. Her son, Joseph II, is the one who tries to modernize the Austrian state along these lines. But it will also cause a diplomatic shift, which we'll come to in a little while. And you'll get to read this in your textbook as well. But it means success. Absolute monarchy means success. That's why everybody copies it in the 18th century. Again, we think of it coming from the Anglo-Saxon heritage, Anglosphere, absolute monarchy bad, freedom, liberty, blah, blah, blah. Liberty is what aristocrats have. That's what absolute monarchy was trying to overcome. Aristocrats were a problem. Liberty wasn't for the common people. That'll come from other sources later in the 18th century. And so that's why we had this skewed notion of it. It was actually a popular thing for obvious reasons. Last thing I'll show you is just pictures of the monarchs. That's Frederick the Great. Man who was into art, poetry, so wrote bad poetry, bad French poetry, was friends with Voltaire, amongst other things. And on the right-hand side, Maria Theresa of Austria. Fascinating figure in her own right. Successful-ish ruler. Again, still not quite the modernizer the rest of these rulers were. Very strict in her upbringing of her daughters, one of whom, by the way, will be Marie Antoinette. That's her daughter. Very Catholic monarch of Austria there. So in any case, what you have in absolutism, absolute monarchy, is a response, again, to the crises of the early parts of the 17th century, and it seems to be the solution, and it seems to work over a broad period of time. Again, next time we'll talk about the biggest main alternative to this, which will be the monarchy of the United Kingdom, which will take a very different route. And of course, is the route that has, for us, the most significance is in an American setting, but also worldwide. It'll be the alternative. And so you'll begin to have the clash of the 18th century between the British and the French. So that is that. And so next time I have a lecture on the Revolution of 1688 and the creation of the modern state of Britain. So we'll see you guys next time.